Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. I am Maureen Druin, Executive Director of Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance, and I am so happy to welcome you to the 20th Annual Evening for the Environment. I'd like to begin by thanking those of you who made this event possible, the many generous organizations, foundations, and businesses who sponsored tonight, especially Lee Auto Malls, Elliottsville Foundation, Island Institute, and our 20th anniversary sponsor, Bangor Savings Bank. I'd also like to thank our host committee, the event planning committee, boards of directors, and our fabulous staff, especially Stacy Haynes, who managed all of the event details, and also Rainey Schaefer, Gina Sawin, Maggie Summers, and Greta Warren. Thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the University of New England Innovation Hall for making things go smoothly tonight. It's the 20th anniversary of the Evening for the Environment. And I remember when Eliza Townsend, Eliza is here, raise your hand, our first executive director, organized the first one at 1 Longfellow Square. The focus that year was on cleaning up the Androscoggin River and the importance of the Clean Water Act, which is a landmark law that just turned 50 yesterday. Now, my first evening as executive director was with Bill McKibben at the Glickman Library at USM. I was 9 months pregnant, and we ran out of seats for our guests, including our awardee at the time, Adam Lee and his family. And Adam didn't hold it against us, and people still had a great time. And while the event has changed and grown over the years, one thing has remained constant. Despite the challenges we face to our climate, environment, and democracy, in Maine, nationally, and globally, we come together once a year to celebrate our shared work. Now, it's been 3 years since we held this event in person, and for many of us, the pandemic gave us an even deeper appreciation of this place we now call Maine, the homeland of the Wabanaki people. When so much of society was closed, people turned to nature for exercise, comfort, healing, and peace. The salty taste of seawater, the smell of balsam fir in deep forest, watching your child go fishing or climb a mountain for the first time. In Maine, our connection to the natural world runs deep. As Wendell Berry says, the earth is what we all have in common. Now, it's been 3 years since we were last together in person for the evening, and we've made a lot of progress during that time. The Maine Climate Council wrote Maine Won't Wait, a 4-year climate action plan. Over 75 municipalities joined the state's Community Resilience Partnership. The state legislature replenished the Land for Maine's Future program with $40 million in the state budget. The state legislature improved access to safe drinking water for the Passamaquoddy tribe at Sabiac. We became the first state in the nation to ban the application of PFAS-contaminated sludge and compost. And we finally passed federal climate legislation. Now, it takes all of us, environmental, labor, and social justice organizations, businesses, philanthropists, artists, poets, musicians, scientists, and so many more to turn our shared commitment into policies that protect our environment, health, and climate future. And I'd like to ask the members of the state legislature who are with us tonight to please stand up, and also Commissioner Amanda Beal of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. So if you all would please stand up. You deserve our profound thanks for your service and dedication showing up to the State House, being tough negotiators, and getting policy solutions across the finish line. Thank you so much. Next, I am so excited to recognize another leader, our next speaker, Safiya Khalid, who is Executive Director of one of the newest groups in Maine, Community Organizing Alliance. Safiya is a rock star. In 2019, at 23 years old, Safiya became the first Somali American elected to the City Council of Lewiston, winning nearly 70% of the vote. She served on the City Council for 2 years while she was working as Leadership Programs Manager for Gateway Community Services. And that's when I first got to meet Safiya. We were at a lot of coalition meetings together. As Safiya was terming off the City Council in 2021, she took the first step in giving form to an idea that was brewing and that has since grown into the Community Organizing Alliance, an organization that is grounded in her many experiences as an immigrant, student, organizer, and elected official in Lewiston. Now, building this organization would be impressive on its own, but Safiya is also getting her Master's of Public Administration at Northeastern University and has continued her work at Gateway. Safiya's commitment to her community, social justice, and civic engagement comes through in everything she does, as does her determination and very, very hard work. Now, I'm truly honored to welcome Safiya here tonight. And before she comes up, we're going to play a short video about her new organization. Thank you.
COA aims to bring communities together, where we listen to people about their issues, about their concerns, their challenges, and then the idea is to educate people. Right, to educate them so that we give them the tools, the skills, and we empower them, that they are able to go back in their communities, into these different sectors, and able to feel that they can make a change by speaking up. And lastly, we aim to organize, where we would like to do relational organizing and deep canvassing, especially in election season, right, where many communities will be able to step up and bring more of their friends and their circle and their network to go out to vote, to really take action in however they look like. Community Organizing Alliance is really to center the voices and experiences of BIPOC people so that they can shape their communities however they see fit.
Wow, it's a lot of you. Hi, everyone. My name is Safiya Khalid. I am the co-founder and executive director of COA. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about COA. And COA is deeply rooted in my lived experience as a grassroots organizer, as well as an elected official, as well as somebody who carries a lot of identities in our beautiful state of Maine. Community Organizing Alliance is a newly created organization that seeks to center the experiences and voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be civically engaged and involved in their communities. As a young Black woman who has both personal and professional experience in political spaces, from grassroots campaign organizing, youth leadership, community engagement, to holding a public office, I have firsthand experience what changes need to happen in order to build a people power movement. In recent years, we've been part of a call to re-envision a society that is just and fair, and that starts with our civic duty. As we built the organization, COA has identified 3 central programs to achieve our vision. These include community listening circles to identify common values, ideals, and action plans, leadership support for those already elected officials to public office, and building the bench so that more BIPOC individuals are prepared to run and can lead. Our goal as an organization is to bring marginalized communities together to create spaces that are safe, where people can be vulnerable, and that centers empathy, compassion, and care for each other's issues, challenges, and struggles at the heart of our organization. There are so many challenges and struggles BIPOC residents and neighbors face that have not been paid attention to due to systemic inequities and historical oppression. We envision a community that is united and empowered to fight and advocate for these issues that are essential to their daily lives, and build a civic engagement movement that resonates with members. COA will accomplish these goals by focusing on relational organizing, deep canvassing, support systems, and training and workshops. So let me stop reading and tell you a little bit more about what has been happening so far. So we created this organization May. We launched May of this year, and it has been incredible. Many people have came up to me asking if I am hiring. Many people have came up to me wanting to participate in the LEO program. The LEO program stands for Listening, Education, and Organizing, in which it has 3 sessions. And the entire program ranges from 6 to 8 hours. It's a lot of time commitment. But COA is rooted in my lived experience as someone who did a lot of grassroots organizing in the 2018 midterm elections, ran for office in 2019, and unfortunately, for bad reasons, my campaign made international headlines because of racist and xenophobia that I have faced during my campaign. But nonetheless, I have won that election almost 70% of the vote because Maine and the voters I won that election because Maine is a welcoming, embracing, loving state. That's why we came here more than 20 years ago, so that we can live in this beautiful state and call it home. And all these years later, we continue to thrive and live in this state. So regardless of what those trolls online have said, I still won the election because I was having real conversations with real people who actually mattered at the door. But unfortunately, I'm still young. As a young, energetic, passionate person who loves her, her community, her city, and her state, I didn't anticipate the difficulties that I would face, right? From an institutional, systemic perspective, so I unfortunately faced a lot because of all the identities I carry, because I was the only person of color, I felt that I did not have support. My community was not there. The people who were mainstream organizations and allies were not there throughout those 2 years. It was very absent. Because of that, I was mentally and emotionally drained. And it's not an isolated situation. Many people of color who run for office experience that throughout our country. So COA, and then also I asked why. I knew that many people really resonated with my issue, with my platform. Many people were also fighting for these issues that I deeply care about. Many issues were interested in the policies that I was advocating for. But why? What is the absence for? And it's because of the inequities that were intentionally put there to keep people like me away. So I took a step back from public office to take care of myself and my well-being, because if I could not show up for myself, how can I show up for my community? So COA is a way to unite people. It is a way to build skills, to train people, to provide workshops about the different systems, about the institutions, about the power structure, from the state to the federal, as well as to the local level. So again, we launched in May, and we have been having this incredible program called the LEO program, stands for Listening, Education, and Organizing. Membership has been from 18 participants, sometimes 15 participants. We hold the meetings every other month. I am currently the only facilitator. I would love to hire more people. It's a lot of work. But in terms of my needs and what we have seen so far, many of the people share their experiences of being a Mainer, right? Being Black in America, being Black in Maine. How does that feel? And many of them are dealing with everyday issues of, workforce development, the lack thereof. They're dealing with mentoring, youth after-school programs, lack of affordable housing, healthcare, and so many other issues. They come and share in this very safe space that is authentic and intentional, because that's what COA is built for. We need to listen to people before we jump to an action. So our organizations bring people together to provide listening sessions, and then we provide trainings in education, and then we figure out, okay, what are some actions that we can take? Whether it's about a workshop on a resume we did last week, to where bringing employers and LEO members together for active job recruitment, to doing some policy work at the state legislature, and so much more. The possibilities are endless. And that's what I envisioned. And so far, because of MCV's support and so many similar organizations, COA has been doing incredible, and people are seeing them. But capacity is very limited. And one thing, there's a big audience in front of me, and one thing that I would like to ask each and every one of you in terms of supporting COA is supporting the members who come through the LEO meetings. Again, we had 15 members in July, September, we had 15 members. They take 6 to 8 hours out of their day to come and share their authentic life experience and ways to change their own communities. I would love people to sponsor members who come through the LEO program. And I can list the sponsorship. So, each student is $200. If few of you sponsored 3 students, it can take us into next year. So we have a table. It's very small. But thank you. I'm sitting. We honestly couldn't find more materials to put in there, so I'm just kidding. But anyways, thank you so much for this opportunity. Me being here right now, talking, not a lot of people get this opportunity. And when I approached MCV, I have developed an incredible relationship with Maureen, who is a dear friend of mine. And I honestly could not have done all that I could, all that we have accomplished without MCV and all the similar organizations. So again, we have we have a website that was donated by IBAC Creative. For a few months they worked on it. We did not pay anything. And that is the kind of support that continues to push us to greatness. So again, thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving me this platform. And have a wonderful night.
Wow, these are some super bright lights. I can't see you at all. I'm Jennifer Melville. I'm the MCV Board Chair. Bill Ginn, MCA Board Chair, who is out there, I know. Please wave, Bill. And I are so grateful to each of you for all that you do to ensure a safe, healthy, and bountiful Maine for all. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Safiya, for your leadership, your bravery, your vision. You're making sure that every Maine voice is heard and everyone can engage meaningfully in their communities and in the conversation about our democracy. All of us at MCV and MCA encourage you to follow the growth and support the incredible work happening at Community Organizing Alliance. So thank you again, Safiya, for being here and for all the work you're doing. So the work that Safiya is doing with Community Organizing Alliance exemplifies democracy in action, democracy at its best. Now we're going to hear from journalist and author Colin Woodard, who's deeply engaged in dissecting and helping us understand this democracy. Through his work, Colin delves into the history of our nation with all of its complexities, its flaws, its benefits, and then helps signal ways that we can move forward in this uncertain time. My first introduction to Colin's work was Unsettled. Some of you may have read this. I hope many of you have. It was a 29-part series published in the Portland Press Herald in 2014. I really never read anything quite like it. Colin recounts in meticulously researched detail the injustice and brutality perpetrated against the Passamaquoddy over several generations. This series holds up a mirror to Maine's dark and recent history. This is not old history, this is now. It's a story that's sadly relevant today and one that every Mainer should know, and I absolutely recommend that you go out and find it if you haven't. It's called Unsettled. You also may know Colin for his more recent books. He's the author of The Lobster Coast, A Cultural and Environmental History of Maine. Or perhaps you've read American Nations, A History of 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. Or for Union, his latest book, which I have to admit I'm only about halfway through, but it is riveting. As one of the nation's leading authorities on North American regionalism, Colin argues and shows us in his recent books that there's never been one America, but actually several Americas, many Americas, each with our own centuries-old ideals, values, and religious and cultural heritage that we hold on to pretty tightly. Colin's going to talk with us tonight about how these long-standing identities and tensions between these cultures, as well as the nation-building myths that we've been fed that are supposed to hold us together, how these things have brought us to this moment where we see our democracy under attack. Colin's going to explore with us how this history informs our fight to protect our land, our water, our air, and our health, and the implications for the future of Maine's environment. So thank you, Colin, wherever you are. Can't see you, but I'm sure you're out there. Thank you, Colin, for being with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Colin. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Those are bright lights. Thank you all. I can indeed barely see any of you. Well, thank you to MCA and MCV for having me, and for all of you for coming tonight and supporting this important set of issues. As mentioned, I'll be talking this evening about some of the foundational characteristics of the United States. Characteristics that have always made it hard for us to maintain a semblance of national unity, and also about the forces that have managed to hold us together in the past. About the colossal struggle between the competing stories of American nationhood that have defined so much of our history, and upon which any hope for environmental justice and lasting environmental progress depends. Much of what I'll say draws from my most recent book, Union, which tracks the long fight. Let's advance this. Which tracks the long fight over the centuries between competing national narratives, a battle for the soul of the nation that continues to this day. But to understand the stakes and to set the stage, a few words on a previous book, American Nations. Now, how many of you have read this book? Oh, a good number of you, very good, very good. Well, for those who haven't, It argues that there's never been one America, but several Americas, and that there are 11 today, most tracing their way back to the differences between the rival regional cultures, the rival colonial projects that formed on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's now the United States. Those projects had different and distinct religious and ethnographic and religious characteristics, different ideas about who they were and where they were going, what they celebrated, what values they held, all the elements of what anthropologists would call culture. These projects were like, the Puritan-founded New England and its extensions, right? Of people who believed that they were in a covenanted relationship with a Calvinist God to do particular things in the world, which was an enormous contrast from their neighbors in the Dutch-settled area around New York City, trying to create a Hanseatic-style global trading city-state where moral issues weren't quite as big an issue. Or the lesser sons of English gentry going into the Chesapeake country to try to reestablish and rebuild the manorial system of the English countryside they'd left behind, like some kind of 17th century Lord Granthams and their Downton Abbeys. Or the Scots-Irish settled backcountry, people from the war-torn borderlands of the English marches and of Ulster, going with a deep commitment to individual liberty and personal sovereignty. The Spanish settled Southwest, the Barbados English slave planters coming into the subtropical lowlands around Charleston and the lowland South, reestablishing a society based on oligarchic privilege, and so on and so forth. These were colonial projects that were rivals and had surprisingly little in common. In fact, they were often enemies during the colonial period, sometimes belonging, of course, to different empires like New Spain or New France, but even the British ones aligned on opposite sides of all of the great conflicts that came up, of the English Civil War of the 1640s, of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89. They had their own intercolonial wars and conflicts. So you've got to ask yourself, well, how did they wind up together? They wound up together through an accident of history. They came together to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy in the 1770s that threatened to destroy the relative autonomy of each of their own individual political and social systems. And to stave off this conforming threat coming out of London, a bunch of them gathered together and formed a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army, a treaty organization to try to organize and supply it in the form of the Continental Congress, which had to move around its place of meeting throughout, as the battle line shifted from one place to another. And miraculously, this ad hoc coalition won. And they found themselves inside something called the United States. But nobody knew exactly what that was. So the fact is, the United States came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an ends initially for the parties involved. Nobody at the time thought that they had created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were, and that the German Romantic thinkers hoped that the little micro-states of the German Confederation might one day become. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have a sense of dwelling in some mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd killed or pushed out many of the people who could make such a claim in living memory. They lacked a shared political heritage apart from the imperial ties they just revolted against, and they had no shared story of who they were and what their purpose was. In short, they had none of the foundations most would-be nations had to try to create a nation state. They had no story to bring and hold them together. Here, by the way, for those not familiar with it, are the regional cultures today mapped out at a county level. They each had exclusive settlement zones that they colonized outwards, and they've left their trail and heritage and characteristics to a great degree in the different regional cultures those colonial projects left in their stead. But I wondered, after writing American Nations, how and when did this change? Because clearly it did. At some point, these differences were papered over rhetorically by a story that convinced us that we had a shared origin story, a shared past, a common American culture, a shared sense of purpose and definition of who belonged and why, a national narrative. And I wondered, who created this story, and when, and why? How was it disseminated? And what lessons does it have for us today when the Federation again stands in jeopardy? Such stories are required for every nation, be it Germany or France or ourselves, because as individuals, to have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to other nations, that we're bound to its fellow members more closely than to those who aren't members of this nation, that we might ultimately literally give our lives for it, that requires a very compelling and credible story. An idea that's evocative and feels true on some deep level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we're together. Now, intellectuals from Jill Lepore and Michael Lind to David Brooks and Ross Douthat have all pointed to the need for a new U.S. national story today, or possibly a renewed one, so as to provide a communal identity, incorporating an understanding of our national purpose and origins and possible future. People need such a story, and as Lepore has put it, they can get it from scholars, or they can get it from demagogues, but get it, they will. A society without a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble. For in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. Ideas are among the most powerful forces in human society, and national narratives are among the most consequential of all ideas. But even as they're powerful, obviously they're abstractions. And in writing Union, I was also interested in just how something goes from being an idea in somebody's head to somehow get out into the zeitgeist, into the shared consciousness, and thus reshape the world. So I wanted to write and research this story biographically, through the lives and actions of the people who actually came up with and fought with one another over these consequential ideas, to understand their families, their childhoods, their friends and mentors, their enemies, their experiences good and bad that shaped their ideas, and their ability to spread them into the world and have them take root. And so Union reads a bit like a novel with shared storylines of the key figures, parallel narratives that eventually collide. I thought this was the best way to tell the story, just sort of as a dramatic and entertaining, but more importantly, it's the best way to research and understand the story, to follow the material and understand how these ideas evolved and how they succeeded in taking root into the world. Now, the answer ended up being that the effort to create a national narrative, a mythic narrative of American unity, got underway quite early. I thought it was going to be something after the Civil War, right? A cataclysmic struggle. Everybody up in the 1860s and 1870s understood America as being separate states or regional cultures at war with one another, and that somehow in the effort to recover from that terrible conflict, that people had come up with a national narrative out of necessity to win the peace and bond people together. But what surprised me is it actually started in the 1830s in earnest, when the ad hoc story that the United States had been operating under was no longer sufficient. Now, that ad hoc story that had been inherited from the 1770s and through the early Republic was an idea that, hey, we won against the British, right? Go us, right? And that's amazing. We had this incredible struggle, this shared victory. All right, go America. And George Washington, the leader at the time and the sort of, the first president and the wartime leader, was given almost deity-like status. And he had a pantheon around him, like Mount Olympus, and Henry Knox and the Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton and all the rest. But by the 1830s, that was starting to fall apart, in part because the generation that had fought the revolution was dying off and disappearing from the stage. It was no longer part of living memory. You go around talking to college kids now, and of course none of them can remember the shock of 9/11 firsthand. It's a different experience than the lived memory in the beginning. But also by the 1830s, the country had started facing actual secession movements. Right? New England had tried to secede, considered it seriously during the War of 1812. Parts of Greater Appalachia in the 1790s during the Whiskey Rebellion. And there were then, more critically, growing tensions over the institution of slavery, at odds as it was with the foundational values in the Declaration of Independence, the innate equality of humans and their inalienable rights to liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness and consensual representative self-government. Slavery was not going away as the Founding Fathers thought it would, but was instead consolidating, and in the southern region was starting to be defended as an actual good. In short, not having a story as to what the US was and how to hold it together was becoming a national security threat. A narrative, that story of why we were together, was needed, or we would assuredly be drifting apart. And it turned out that there wasn't one story, there were two in competition. A battle over the soul of the nation that unfortunately continues to this day. Now, those stories are, in brief, like this. The effort begins with this man, George Bancroft, largely forgotten today, but he was, bar none, the most famous historian of the 19th century. And he didn't just write history, he made it. As Secretary of War in the Polk administration, he issued the orders that led to the annexation of Texas. As Secretary of the Navy, he established the Naval Academy at Annapolis and gave the instructions to naval captains that caused the annexation of California. He was our ambassador to London and later to Berlin, where he became personal friends with Otto von Bismarck and was riding around the Tiergarten on horses with him. He held dinner parties in later life for presidents and story. And it came in the form of a 10-volume epic history of the United States that took him nearly a half-century of his life to complete, and even then only extended the narrative into the 1790s. It was, in fact, a prehistory of the United States of America, and it made an argument we were one peoples and had been from the beginning, and the argument went something like this. The US, he said, is a nation not of shared bloodlines, but of shared ideals. A fusion, it represented a fusion of his cosmology and his Puritan New England background, right? The idea that God had a plan for his chosen people, an errand in the wilderness, a light on the hill, the creation of a more godly world here on earth, a people with a mission. And he combined that with what he'd learned from his very secular German mentors, the idea of Teutonic exceptionalism, that the ancient Teutons and the Black Forests of Germany were freedom-loving people and passed the baton, the torch of liberty on to the Anglo-Saxons when they invaded Britain. And then those Anglo-Saxons had come to the US and established the latest incarnation of the freedom-loving mission granted people out there in the world. Ideas of historicism from the Germans, right? That history has a plan. Like the contrails of an airplane, if you can look back and study history carefully, you can plot where the plane is going because it's going somewhere specifically. The ideas of a national zeitgeist, that peoples have a collective consciousness that can be shaped by different ideas. And the ideas that nations are organic beings that develop their characteristics inexorably from the codes inside their seeds. And in the process, he argued this, that America its mission was it was charged with furthering the cause of human freedom. The ideals in the Declaration of Independence I mentioned earlier, to shape it and move it across the continent and around the world. And it could not fail, he believed, because the currents of history and the hand of God obviously wished it so. Herein in his narrative, which spread everywhere and became the subject of all discussion about what the United States was going to be, infected university curricula, the way people talked about the country, paintings that were made in the Capitol and elsewhere, it contained in it, though, the tropes of American exceptionalism, the hubris of empire, a rationale for conquest that could only eventually cut against the very ideals it was meant to spread. But also, it birthed the American promise, the aspiration to create and further a free society theoretically open to all, devoted to the equality of opportunity, equality before the law, representative self-government, the pursuit of happiness and all that, the government by and for all of the people that Lincoln would later hope would not perish from the earth. But this civic national narrative was challenged from the moment it was unveiled. And the figure who led the charge against it was one of Bancroft's friends and colleagues, another famous man in his time who is forgotten today. This man, William Gilmore Simms. Forgotten, of course, but that would amaze people in the early 19th century because he was one of the most successful and popular and acclaimed novelists in early America and the antebellum South. A writer compared favorably often to Cooper and to Edgar Allan Poe, and was the leading public intellectual, bar none, of the antebellum South and the ultimate Confederate man of letters. He was from Charleston and from South Carolina, though, and had very different ideas about what America or the United States should be and represent. And he immediately, when he saw what Bancroft had written and the reaction to it, countered. And he and a group of Southern intellectuals who circled around him said, no, Jefferson was absolutely wrong when he wrote the Declaration. People are not created equal. They're highly unequal. And in fact, only a small subset of people are capable and advanced enough to have the genius to use the ideals and take advantage of the ideals and promise in the Declaration. And those people are the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race. In fact, America, he said, was the homeland of such people, or the homelands. Each of the colonies was an Anglo-Saxon ethno-state devoted to those people, this Herrenvolk. And it was built, how could you imagine being in a country devoted to democracy that had these ideas? Well, it's because in the Deep South and in the Tidewater country, the model was a classical republicanism. A republicanism, right, based on and modeled on the classical republics of antiquity, on ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where societies where a small set elite of the population was granted the liberty or the privilege to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery were considered the natural lot of the many, a good that was required even to have a republic. That was the argument that had control over that part of the country, and which William Gilmore Simms put forward very forcefully in his own works. Now this, of course, the battle between these ideas, this epic struggle, dominated the 1830s and the 1840s and would lead us propelled into a civil war where 100,000 people would die. And in the process, there was a pivotal figure who emerged, the pivotal figure in our whole narrative. Oh, sorry, advancing one more. This man, who you should recognize and hasn't been forgotten, Frederick Douglass, right? Escaped from slavery in Maryland, came and was discovered by the early Garrisonians, the abolitionists, who saw that he had this incredible speaking ability and an unbelievable story to tell, a first-hand view of what it was like to be enslaved and the moral corruption that it tore on both master and enslaved alike. And they grabbed him. They said, you're going to be our star speaker, and we're going to set you on railway tours. And they sent him all over the northern tiers of the country to use his oratorical power and share his story. And he ended up being an incredible writer as well. He taught himself to read and write in secrecy, even though it was effectively illegal in Maryland at the time to teach enslaved people to read and write. And he used his incredible skills throughout his career. He became an international superstar, a best-selling author, one of the most famous people of that entire age. And the message that he brought in his decades-long career was essentially taking and appropriately correcting that civic national narrative that Bancroft had given the first take. The big correction being, Douglass said, these are good ideals, and you, and he was essentially speaking to white Northerners at the time, you have failed them. You're betraying them every day. You know, I can tell you firsthand how it's been betrayed from my own experiences, but it's happening here in the North, and you need to rally together because these are the promise you should have. And a promise not just for African Americans. He defended everyone who was under attack, right? He was one of the few men who appeared at the Seneca Convention, the Women's Suffrage Convention. He was close friends with Susan B. Anthony. He defended Irish Americans and Catholic Americans and Chinese Americans at different times when they were all under attack. And his argument was, you haven't achieved those ideals. Yes, there's a quest to fulfill them, but it's not something that's going to be inevitable, like Bancroft said. It's something we all must fight for and that we have not achieved yet. And in the process of re-articulating that, trying to influence and prod people as the Civil War approached, in the aftermath of the Civil War, and the struggles over Reconstruction and the occupation of the South and the dark periods that followed thereafter, he articulated some of the civic national vision of the United States better than anyone has before or since. He personally went down and influenced Lincoln when Washington, D.C. was surrounded on three sides by Confederate troops, and him being captured would mean a death sentence. He went multiple times to the White House and helped convince Lincoln to finally insert in his famous address at Gettysburg in the middle of the war in 1863 that commitment, for the first time committing the United States in its struggle and as official policy to the idea that it was trying to protect that unfilled promise in the Declaration. But it's often said that the South lost the war, but then won the peace. And that victory was crowned by the ascension of this man, Woodrow Wilson. Now, we think of Woodrow Wilson, right, as the governor of New Jersey and, the president of an Ivy League institution at Princeton, but Wilson was actually from the Deep South. He was raised in Augusta, Georgia, in the ashes of the Columbia, South Carolina, the South Carolinian capital that had been burned by Sherman. He was a deep Southerner through and through, and the first deep Southerner to ascend to the presidency. His father had been one of the most important intellectuals in the Confederacy. He had been the leading light of the Confederate Presbyterian Church, a reputation built upon an essay that he was incredibly popular in the antebellum South, arguing that slavery was ordained by God. An outrageous racist of the most rough-shod sort, who Woodrow Wilson worshipped throughout his life and through his memoirs and saw as a role model. And he carried the values that were brought with him, and he grew up with his father and in those terrains, with him into his academic career, into the academic articles he wrote, into the histories he wrote, which cast Reconstruction and the effort, the short-lived effort to ensure the political emancipation of African Americans in the former Confederacy, that had been a terrible thing and had obviously been backwards. He personally, when he finally reached the presidency, that was the crowning moment. He brought in a Dixie cabinet for the first time and personally set forward and segregated the federal government, the Union government that had won the Civil War. He personally intervened to block the anti-racism provisions introduced by Japan at the League of Nations from going forward. He aided in the movement that led to the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act, with its explicitly stated mission to restrict immigration so as to maintain the Anglo-Saxon character of the United States. He presided over the zenith of Jim Crow laws and the construction of many of the Confederate monuments that we're now tearing down. And he backed Birth of a Nation, right? The first Hollywood blockbuster film, right? Epic film in multiple reels. The guy who, D.W. Griffith, who created the film, discovered Hollywood and founded Hollywood in the process of making this film. Technically, no one had seen anything like it. But it was a film where the plot was the celebration of the Ku Klux Klan's violent terrorist campaign to end the political emancipation of African Americans in the South. They were the heroes of the film. That was the message, right? A message of inequality and white supremacy was key to it. Now, this was controversial even at the time in 1915. There were massive protests against it. It was considered an outrage in Boston and in New York and elsewhere, like a Black Lives Matter-like protest. They were going to block the movie from being shown. Because remember, this is at a time when the Supreme Court had yet to rule that artistic productions are protected speech under the First Amendment. So theatrical productions and films were often censored by mayors and governors if they were considered contrary to public morals. And that's exactly what the activists wanted to have happen. And this was going to be a disaster for D.W. Griffith and his co-producer, Thomas Dixon Jr., who'd written the book upon which it was based, The Klansman. And if the movie didn't show, it had a massive multi-gazillion-dollar budget, if it didn't show in the major markets like Boston and New York, they would go bankrupt and it would be terrible. What did we do? They threw a Hail Mary pass. Thomas Dixon Jr. went to his good friend and graduate school classmate, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, and asked him for help. And Wilson showed the film in the White House to his cabinet. And news items went out the next day. And then Thomas Dixon Jr. ran across the street and found the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice White, and convinced him to show it in one of the biggest ballrooms in D.C. to the other Supreme Court justices and the leaders of Congress. And this transformed it, made it impossible for governors and mayors to restrict the film when it was getting the implicit endorsement of the entire leadership in Washington, D.C. And as a result, this film was used as a narrative and a recruiting tool for the creation and founding of a second Ku Klux Klan that rose in the 1920s and 1930s to have more than 2 million members. What I'm saying is, this was the moment when one of these two national narratives triumphed across the Federation, across the regional cultures, and it was not the better of the two, right? It was a triumph of an ethno-national and white supremacist one. And that's why these forces, the danger, the power that is unleashed when these are tapped on, are so consequential, because unfortunately, it goes as deep as our good narrative of being committed to ideals. They've been locked in battle throughout our history from the beginning. But fortunately, this ethno-national triumph was short-lived. The civic nationalist narrative dethroned it in the 20th century. Mass conscription in both world wars produced multi-ethnic units and multiracial armies, whose members felt that they'd earned rights to full citizenship and consecrated them with blood sacrifices. African-American veterans of these wars formed the backbone of resistance that culminated in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which challenged the apartheid systems of the South. The Cold War compelled federal officials simultaneously to support this movement at critical junctures. This was because the conflict with the Soviet Union had become in many respects a proxy war in what was then called the Third World for the hearts and minds of essentially non-white populations. And the Soviets could accurately and effectively tell these people in these wars for hearts and minds, hey, if you or your ambassadors and diplomats try to travel in any of 3 directions from Washington, D.C., they'll be denied access to beaches, to restrooms, to restaurants and hotels, even the hotels hosting the conferences they've been invited to. They'll be treated as second-class citizens, as racially inferior. These are enormous scandals that were happening regularly for the diplomats of many of the newly independent states in the post-colonial period. And this, Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, and most certainly JFK and LBJ, realized was a national security weakness in this Manichaean struggle in the Cold War that could not stand. And so, the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. The feminist movement demanded social and professional and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population. Gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. Elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boys networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1964 that repealed ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. And a new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative, Woodrow Wilson and others, that had dominated scholastic textbooks by then for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And so, for the first time, the civic national narrative became dominant and to the fore. America became a liberal democracy, small l, small d, for the first time in that era. And for my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, it seemed permanent, right? That the white supremacist model had been toppled forever when we were children or before. We'd elected an African-American president twice, after all. But of course, ethno-nationalism had not been vanquished. And I believe it's essential for the United States' survival that it is, because it can't hold us together, but rather is a formula for disorder and dissolution. And that won't be good for the rest of the world either. And it's also essential for confronting what is actually the greatest crisis facing humanity in the 21st century, the fraying of the life-sustaining properties of the planet. Climate change, rapid extinction of species, the destruction of the natural systems that make the one world we have habitable for humans. There's a reason I turned from covering ethnic conflict in the Balkans and elsewhere to being a globe-trotting correspondent covering environmental issues and the rising threat of global warming for more than a decade. But I've largely returned to those themes I started at and covered in the Balkans: the battle over historical memory, the fights over national identities, stories of belonging and othering, the use of very big lies to convince people that doing great evil is in fact furthering good, democracy and its discontents, and that for a reason as well. Because the economy may be a subset of the environment, but environmental justice is a subset of having a liberal democracy. An illiberal society, by definition, doesn't value the rights of the other. An ethno-nationalist society, by definition, cares only about the dominant group's interests and subjugating those denied membership in this master group. And authoritarian and autocratic regimes generally have terrible environmental policies, being unresponsive to the plight of those at the bottom who suffer first and most as ecological systems come apart. Yes, China's system can roll out electric cars and solar farms at a fast clip, but only after deadly smog and crippling droughts and uncontainable floods have already put the stability of the regime at risk. But most every other autocracy and dictatorship in the world, from the Soviet Union to contemporary Russia, Mugabe's Zimbabwe to Bolsonaro's Brazil, have disastrous environmental track records. So, for the sake of democracy and the environment, we need to rediscover, reinvigorate, and adapt our lost civic national narrative story for 21st century life, and finally put the ethno-national one in the trash bin of history. This is the work going forward I'm doing at Nationhood Lab, a project I'm running at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy in Newport, Rhode Island, which I'm happy to share with any of you when we're offline, so to speak. And with that, I thank you all for your time, for the work you do, and for your interest in all of this. Good night.
How would you like to follow that? Colin, thank you. That was really terrific, and all it takes is listening to a talk like that to realize how little you really know. So, thank you. We're almost done. We got like 3 more minutes. I have to tell a very quick story. I think I've told it before. Before I knew Maureen, 15 years ago, I was sitting at my desk and I get handed a message from someone that Maureen Druin from MCV called. I really didn't know what they did, and I just thought, oh, God, I'm not calling her back. So the next day, I get handed another message. Maureen Druin from Maine Conservation Voters called, would like you to call back. And I thought, oh, no, they just want money. I'm not calling back. This is true. Third day, I get a message. Maureen Druin from Maine Conservation Voters called. She doesn't want money. I called her back. Anyway, that was the story. I want to say 2 more things. One, there are people in this audience who can help Safiya out in COA. I encourage you to go home and figure out how to send them a donation. Clearly, she's doing terrific work. The next time you go out to dinner, don't go out to dinner. It's young people like this that we need to be leading, certainly Maine, out of some of the things that Colin's talking about. So, thank you, Safiya. The last thing I want to mention is that 22 years ago, Maine has had a terrific environmental win. 22 years ago, the Maine People's Alliance and NRDC joined up and filed a lawsuit against Mallinckrodt, which back then was Holtrachem. They were suing them to get them to clean up the Penobscot River because they had dumped 6, 8, 12 tons of mercury in the river. This suit has been going on for 22 years. They just settled. They will have to pay Maine to clean this up $187 million with a contingency fund of $80 million. And so I want to thank these 2 groups for persevering. "22 years is a really long time to fight a company that has, a fleet of lawyers. But they did it, they stuck with it. So I just want to remind everyone, perseverance pays off. We'll be here in 20 more years or 22 years. We're going to show a brief video as we exit the stage. You should stay and watch it. It's just a few minutes, talks about the organization. Yes, okay, I would like you to say something.
Just thank you to Adam for chairing the event committee. We appreciate that. And thank you again to Colin and Safiya. And this video is a short organizational video because when we do this event, we don't really talk much about the work of our organization. So this is a pretty quick one. And it features several people in the audience. So stay tuned, and thank you again so much for coming tonight. And after this, the event will be over. So thank you. So thanks again for coming.
I have been involved with MCV since, indirectly for a long, long time, but I became a board member in 2013.
I've been supportive, along with my family, of Maine Conservation Voters and the Conservation Alliance for almost 20 years.
I sought out an internship with Maine Conservation Voters because I'm heading to grad school next year to study public policy and I want to study environmental policy. So I wanted to get that background. And Maine Conservation Voters is a really interesting organization in getting that type of experience. They're doing the lobbying, they're doing research, they're doing work relating to voter rights, they're doing work related to racial equity tied to climate change.
We work with MCV and MCA through the Environmental Priorities Coalition. The EPC picks priority bills every session for the coalition to focus on. MCV, MCA, they manage that coalition, they're the lead in that coalition, so their input is very important. Those priority bills, when you get, as we have been lucky enough to have done, when you get a bill that is a priority bill with the EPC, you get a lot of resources with that partnership.
I think the work that MCV does is incredibly effective. I mean, one of my favorite projects that we do every year is an accountability program, doing the scorecard for all of the state legislators and a report on how the governor's doing. And it's a way for our members to see how their representatives are voting in the State House and how they're doing when it comes to the protection of natural resources here and clean air and clean water, and making sure that we all have the ability to get out in the landscape that we all love to do. And that accountability I've seen in firsthand how legislators respond to it, and they want to know whether or not the votes that they're taking are going to be scored, and it's a really powerful way to hold members of the legislature accountable.
Maine Conservation Voters is one of the most effective environmental groups, we believe, in Maine. It's where Maine's environment and politics comes together, and it's a very effective advocate in the legislature, and it's also a real resource for legislators. A lot of the environmental legislation is complex, and the staff is so knowledgeable and so experienced that they are able to basically reach every legislator in the State House, as well as work with the governor's office.
You look at the advocates who are working at Maine Conservation Voters, and they are showing up every day toggling with that same doubt and fear that all of us have looking ahead at climate action. But what they're choosing to do with that fear is confront it, and they're working with empathy and emotion towards something that's going to work for all of us towards a brighter future, and they're working within the specifics, and I think that's super hard. Specific bills and day-to-day and different people from organizations every day giving their energy towards that, and I just have so much respect for that.
I appreciate the fact that they recognize how special Maine is and how important it is to protect our natural environment here in Maine, but I also appreciate the fact that they recognize that it's not just the environment. I've mentioned before kind of the intersectionality of the work. I really appreciate their focus on that, and I appreciate them working to make sure that all of this beautiful land that's before us will be here for future generations to enjoy, and I think that that's really important.
I really appreciate MCV's work because not only is it making the state of Maine a great place to be and continuing to protect our natural resources and make it as appealing as a place one could imagine living. I know that because of the hard work that they're doing now, that my children are going to have the same experience growing up here in Maine. But what I really love about MCV's work is the fact that they make it fun. Oftentimes it's not, it's not super interesting to folks to understand the nuances of policy, and sometimes opposition can be overwhelming and hard to deal with. But they bring this kind of levity and joy to the work that they do that always makes it fun and always keeps people engaged. And I think that's why they've been so successful, and that's why their work continues to grow, and the success of the organization continues to grow. And so I think that's a really great aspect to the Maine Conservation Voters and the work that they do.